He promised to stay. But she wasn't ready for what came next. The married manager who changed everything. Elena Vasquez had always believed that the right life would announce itself clearly, like a door opening, like a light switching on. She had believed this through 4 years of college, through a failed engagement that left her engagement ring sitting in a drawer she couldn't bear to open, through 2 years of bouncing between marketing coordinator jobs that never quite fit, and through 27 years of waiting for the universe to hand her something that felt like it was hers. The morning she walked into Morrison and Associates on the 34th floor of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, the city below still waking up, she carried that belief like a talisman in her chest. She was 29 years old. She had a degree in communications from DePaul, a decent wardrobe assembled on a tight budget, and a running habit that was either the healthiest or the most self-destructive thing about her. She genuinely couldn't tell which anymore. She was also, as her therapist Dr. Adler had once put it with clinical precision, in a season of recalibration. The new job was supposed to be the opening of that door. Senior marketing coordinator at Morrison and Associates, a mid-size consulting firm with a reputation for actually caring about its people, or so the recruiter had said during the 3 rounds of interviews that had carried Elena through the gray months of early spring. The salary was better than anything she'd had before. The benefits package included a gym membership and access to a corporate wellness program that offered free yoga classes and quarterly health screenings. The office had floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides, and the moment the elevator doors opened to the 34th floor, Elena had felt something unclench in her ribcage for the first time in months. She told herself it was the light. The wellness program, that was the detail the recruiter had emphasized most enthusiastically. Morrison and Associates took care of its people. Part of that care manifested in the Morrison Runners Club, a company running group that met twice a week before work and logged miles together in the city's lakefront path system. The group was open to all employees, all paces, all levels of experience. It was, according to the onboarding email Elena received on her first day, a wonderful way to meet colleagues across departments and build community. Elena had joined the group the same morning she'd received the email. It was that kind of first day, the kind where everything feels provisional and borrowed, where you're not yet sure if you belong in the room you've been given a key to. She had shown up at the designated meeting point, the lobby of the building at 6:15 a.m., in running shorts and a shirt she bought specifically for this purpose, and had found 7 people already stretching by the glass doors. 6 of them had been men. And one of those men, the tallest, with a calm, deliberate way of checking his watch and then scanning the lobby, had looked up and caught her eye. "Elena Vasquez?" he'd asked. His voice was low, unhurried. He had a way of standing that made him seem like he was occupying exactly the right amount of space, no more, no less. His running gear was neat without being showy, a pair of dark shorts, a gray shirt with the company logo on the chest, and running shoes that looked like they'd seen real miles on real pavement. "That's me," she'd said. "I'm Marcus Chen. I'm the Director of Strategic Accounts. HR told me you'd be joining us this morning. They like to pair new people with a running buddy. Mine's out sick, so I'm yours." He'd said it simply, without any particular warmth or coolness, just the plain fact of something arranged and then followed. "We go at whatever pace you're comfortable with." The group fragments into pace clusters pretty quickly anyway. She'd liked him immediately, or rather, she'd liked the lack of performance in him. There was no charm effects in him, no overeager welcome, no awkward small talk about where she was from or what she'd studied. He introduced her to the group with a few efficient words, adjusted his watch, and fell into step beside her as the group pushed through the glass doors into the cool May morning. That first run was 5 miles. Elena had trained for a half marathon the year before, during the engagement, when she and her then-fiancé David had signed up for one as a couple's activity and then quietly let the training dissolve along with everything else. She could still run 5 miles without stopping. What she couldn't do was run them without her mind spiraling, without her thoughts snagging on the same old grooves of regret and second-guessing that she could not seem to sand down no matter how many miles she logged. Marcus was quiet for the first mile. Not uncomfortable quiet, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from someone who is genuinely focused on the act of running rather than using it as a backdrop for conversation. She found herself skilling glances at him during the second mile, the way his breathing was steady and deep, the way his stride was economical and unhurried, the way he occasionally reached up to adjust the strap of his running watch with his right hand while his left arm swung in a perfect metronome arc. "You've got good form," he said during the third mile, without turning his head. "Thanks." She was breathing harder than she wanted to admit. "Haven't run with a group in a while. It's different. Treadmill running is solitary. Group running is." He paused to navigate around a slower pair ahead of them, adjusting his line smoothly before continuing. "It's like a moving open office. The social pressure keeps you honest." She laughed, surprised. "That's the most corporate thing anyone's ever said to me about runnings." "Fair." He smiled just slightly, just at the corners of his mouth, but it changed the whole architecture of his face. "I spent too many years in boardrooms. Everything starts to sound like a TED Talk eventually." They finished the run at the 5-mile mark, where the group had convened near the concession stand at the path's halfway point. People stretched and talked and complained about hamstring tightness with the easy camaraderie of people who had done this together many times before. Marcus introduced Elena around. Everyone was friendly in that superficial way that new colleagues are friendly, which is to say, welcoming but careful. And then he checked his watch again and said he needed to get cleaned up for an 8 o'clock client call. "Same time Thursday," he said to her. It was a question, not a statement. An opening, not an expectation. "Same time Thursday," she said. He nodded once and headed for the building, his running stride already carrying him past the lobby's glass doors before she could think of anything else to say. She thought about him for the rest of that first day in a way that she immediately and firmly told herself was perfectly normal. He had been kind to her. He had been helpful during her onboarding. He had shown her where the coffee machine was that actually worked, the one on the east side of the floor, not the one by HR that everyone pretended worked but actually produced something that was 60% sediment. And he had walked her through the company's internal communication tools with a patience that felt genuine rather than performed. These were the facts, and the facts were professional, and her awareness of the way his voice dropped half a register when he was being particularly patient with something, that was just a neurological response to acoustic stimulus, the equivalent of flinching at a loud noise or leaning toward warmth. It meant nothing. She told herself this with the determined clarity of someone who was deeply practiced at compartmentalizing. By the end of her first week, Elena had been on 3 more runs with the Morrison Runners Club. Marcus had been there for all 3. He had not gone out of his way to pair with her again. The group structure didn't require it, and he was clearly someone who respected structure, but he had been present, and his presence had functioned as a kind of gravitational center for the runs. When he was running ahead, she found herself running faster. When he fell back to run beside her, she felt her breathing steady. When he wasn't there, which happened twice, when he had early client meetings, the runs felt flat and the miles felt longer and the May mornings seemed dimmer than they should have. She noticed this, and she noted that she noticed, and she put it in a box labeled New City, New Job, New Routine. Of course different things feel different, and closed the lid. On the Friday of her first week, the company held its quarterly all-hands meeting in the main conference suite on the 35th floor. Elena sat in the back row with a legal pad and a pen, feeling the particular combination of boredom and alertness that company-wide meetings always induced. Boredom because she had heard some version of every speech before. Alertness because she was still cataloging the personalities and hierarchies of this new environment with the instinctive caution of prey animal learning the layout of a new field. The CEO spoke about growth and vision. The CFO spoke about numbers with a confidence that suggested he had never once lain awake at 3 in the morning wondering if he was good enough. The outrun director introduced the new hires, and when she said Elena's name and Elena raised her hand in the designated little wave, she saw Marcus in the 3rd row turn halfway around in his seat and give her a small nod. Just that. just a nod. The kind you'd give a colleague you've met once or twice and thought well of. It was nothing. It was so clearly nothing that she felt almost ridiculous for the little jolt it gave her, like a spark jumping a gap in a circuit she hadn't known was open. The meeting ended at noon. People filed out toward the elevator bank, chatting in the loose, decompressing way that people chat after being forced to sit still and listen for 2 hours. Elena gathered her legal pad and followed the current of bodies toward the elevators, and as she reached the bank, she felt a hand on her elbow, light, brief, the kind of touch that could be interpreted as accidental if you wanted to interpret it that way. "Morrison Runners is doing a thing," Marcus said. He was standing beside her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something clean and understated, the kind of scent that announced itself only when someone was very near. "A charity 10K in September. Company sponsored, the proceeds go to the Chicago Urban League. I know it's in your onboarding week, no feel free to say no, but I thought you should know." "A 10K, she repeated. Yeah. I can do a 10K. I know you can. You ran 5 miles at a 7:15 pace your first time out." He said it like a fact, like a data point he'd filed away. Which, she supposed, it was. "There's a training group that meets on Tuesday and Saturday mornings. Lower pressure than the weekday runs. More social. You recruiting for the running club now?" "I'm recruiting for the running club." He didn't smile, but she could hear the smile in his voice. "It's a disease. You get people out once, and then they feel committed, and then they start showing up every week even when their knees are telling them to stop, and then suddenly they're buying matching socks and talking about their splits at the holiday party." He pressed the elevator button. "Consider yourself warned." The elevator arrived. They got in with a small crowd of other people. He pressed the button for the 34th floor, her floor, and then, after a pause, the button for the 36th floor. "My office is up there," he said, as if she'd asked. "1 floor up, 1 floor down. Either way, we're neighbors." "Small building," she said, and immediately wished she hadn't, because it was a dumb thing to say and they both knew it. "Very small," he agreed, with a gravity that suggested he was being kind. The elevator doors opened on 34. She got out. He raised 2 fingers in a half salute as the doors began to close, and she stood there watching the scene close between them and thought, "I am in trouble." She did not define the trouble. She did not need to. She was a grown woman who had lived through 1 engagement dissolving and 2 years of subsequent singledom, and she understood the grammar of attraction well enough to know what was happening to her. Marcus Chen was attractive in the way that competence was attractive, which was to say, in a way that had nothing to do with jawlines or eye color and everything to do with the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and did it with a kind of seamless precision that made everything around him look easier than it was. He was also married. She knew this because there was a photo on his desk. She had seen it on her second day, when he'd given her a tour of the floor and paused in his office to pull up a spreadsheet she needed. The photo was small, unobtrusive, placed at the far right corner of his desk next to a ceramic mug that said "World's Best Dad" in letters that had started to fade. In the photo, a woman with long dark hair and a warm, unguarded smile stood on what looked like a beach, squinting against the sun, 1 hand raised to shade her eyes. Next to her, a golden retriever. No kids in the photo, but the mug, and the fact but the mug was still on his desk in an office where everything else was immaculate and minimal, told a story. Elena had filed this information away in the same compartment as the spark in the circuit moment in the elevator, in the box labeled "Irrelevant Data, Do Not Open," and had gone about the business of forgetting it. The trouble, she now understood, had nothing to do with boxers or labels. The trouble was structural. It was load-bearing. It was the wall she'd built between herself and the world after David, and Marcus Chen was standing on the other side of it with a cup of coffee and a quiet, self-possessed way of looking at people that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt since before the wedding she'd never walked down the aisle to. She ran 7 miles that night. She ran until her calves burned and her lungs ached and the sweat was cooling on her neck in the May air, and she did not think about Marcus Chen. She thought nothing. She ran the way you drive when you need to get somewhere and the road is clear and your hands know the wheel. When she got back to her apartment, a one-bedroom in Lincoln Park that she could almost afford on her new salary, she stood in the shower until the water went lukewarm and then lukewarm became cold, and she stood there letting the cold shock her system back into the present moment and thought, "You are going to be fine. You are going to be fine about this." She was not fine about this. The weeks that followed were the kind that build a life without announcing that they're doing it. Elena settled into Morrison and Associates with the gradual comfort of a new shoe softening around its wearer. She learned the names and personalities of the people on her floor, the nosy but kind office manager named Patricia who kept a bowl of candy on her desk that was always running low, the junior analyst named Jaylene who ate lunch at his desk every day and listened to true crime podcasts while he chewed, the senior vice president named Diane who walked through the office like a weather system and whose approval could make or break a career trajectory. She learned the rhythms of the work itself, the rhythms of quarterly reports and client presentations and the endless, subtle negotiation of who got credit for what. She was good at her job. She had always been good at her job, in the quiet, unsung way that didn't generate accolades but did generate a steady accumulation of trust. Her supervisor, a mid-40s woman named Karen who had the kind of aggressive competence that made Elena feel both inspired and slightly exhausted, had started giving her more substantive projects by the 3rd week. By the 6th week, Elena was leading a client pitch deck for a mid-sized nonprofit that wanted to rebrand its online presence. It was on the night of the 3rd revision of that pitch deck, a night when she had been at her desk until 9:30, alone on a floor that had gone dark and quiet except for the fluorescent hum and the distant sound of the building's HVAC system cycling down for the evening, that Marcus appeared at the edge of her cubicle. "I saw the light on," he said. He was holding a coffee cup, and his tie was loosened, and he looked tired in a way that made him look younger. "Karen's team?" "Guilty." She leaned back in her chair and pressed her palms against her eyes. "The client wants to refine the emotional narrative of their brand identity, which is a 12-word sentence that means they have no idea what they want, but they're sure they don't have it yet." Marcus made a sound that was half laugh, half sigh. "The nonprofit sector's favorite sport. I've been in 8 of those pitches this year." He tilted his head, considering her. "When did you last eat something?" She thought about it. "Lunch. Maybe. Lunch." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite decode, something between exasperation and concern, something that landed somewhere in the neighborhood of care. "There's a place on Wabash that doesn't close until 11. Thai. The pad CEW is extraordinary and the service is fast. You look like someone who could use fast right now." It was not a date. It was not even close to a date. It was 2 colleagues, one of whom was a senior director and one of whom was a new hire, discussing the logistical possibility of food at a late hour. Elena understood this. She understood it with the same clarity with which she understood that the sun rose in the east and that water was wet and that Marcus Chen's loosened tie was doing something architectural to her ability to form coherent thoughts. "That sounds incredible," she said. "Let me save my files." They walked to the restaurant. It was a 6-minute walk, according to Marcus, who seemed to know the distances between things the way some people know the lyrics to songs, not memorized exactly, just absorbed. The May night was warm and the city was doing its after-dark thing, the sidewalks populated with joggers and dog walkers and couples holding hands and people sitting on restaurant patios with glasses of wine catching the light. Elena walked beside Marcus with her work bag over one shoulder and felt a strange, electric awareness of the space between their bodies, 3 inches of air that might as well have been a live wire. He ordered for both of them without asking, which should have annoyed her and didn't, pad CEW for her, drunken noodles for him, spring rolls to share, no dessert because they both needed to be functional tomorrow. The restaurant was small and warm and loud in the comfortable way that Thai restaurants are loud, and they sat at a table near the back and ate with a focus that left little room for conversation for the first 10 minutes. Then Marcus put down his fork and said, "Tell me something." "Why marketing?" Elena looked up. He was watching her with that steady, appraising attention that she was beginning to recognize as his default mode, not intrusive, not performative, just genuinely present in a way that made her feel like the thing she was saying mattered. "It's the only thing I'm good at that also pays," she said. It came out more honest than she'd intended. "I used to think I'd do something else." "Right, maybe. I took some creative writing classes in college. But then I graduated and rent needed paying and marketing was the thing that was available, and after a while you stop distinguishing between what you do and who you are." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's the trap. The reasonable compromise that becomes the permanent architecture. Do you feel like that? About what you do?" He considered the question with a seriousness that suggested it was worth considering. "Some days. I think I've gotten good at making the architecture feel like a choice rather than a sentence." "That helps." He took a sip of water. "What would you write if you could write anything?" She hadn't expected the question, and it caught her off guard in a way that made her eyes sting, which made her angry at herself, which made her reach for her glass of water to have something to do with her hands. "I don't know anymore," she said. That's the honest answer. I used to know. I used to have, I don't know, a novel I was working on, some half-formed thing about a woman who moves to a new city and keeps finding herself in the wrong rooms. Very on the nose, very first novel energy. I wrote in the margins of everything, notebooks, receipts, the margins of work documents. Then at some point I stopped. Why? Because it started feeling like evidence of something I didn't want to know about myself. He was quiet for a moment. Then, that's a good answer. It's a deflection. Most deflections contain more truth than the things they're deflecting from. He picked up his fork again. For what it's worth, I think you should write again. Not the novel. Just something. Morning pages, voice memos, whatever. The margins are where the real you lives. She looked at him across the table, at his tired eyes and his loosened tie in the small, careful way he was holding space for her confession, and she felt something in her chest that she recognized as dangerous. It was not attraction, not anymore. It was something more destabilizing than that. It was the feeling of being understood by someone who had no obligation to understand her, and who chose to anyway. Tell me about you, she said. The real Marcus Chen origin story. How did a strategic accounts director end up being the company's unofficial running club coordinator? He laughed, a real laugh, warm and unperformed. Strategic accounts director is a very long title for a person who makes clients feel comfortable giving us money. And the running thing started because my wife, he said the word casually, naturally, the way you say the sky is blue, as a reference to something so fundamental it required no emphasis. My wife wanted to get in shape after our wedding, and I needed a way to convince her that running was fun instead of punishment, and the only way to do that was to make it social. So I started rounding up colleagues, and one thing led to another, and now I'm the guy who sends the Tuesday morning reminder emails. Wife, Elena repeated. She kept her voice flat and uninterested. How long? 5 years this October. We got married in Napa. Her family's from the Bay Area, so it felt right. He talked about his wife the way he talked about everything, with precision, with care, with the quiet authority of someone who had chosen his life and was committed to the choice. Her name is Diane. She works in healthcare administration at Northwestern. She does the kind of work that's genuinely important and almost never gets covered in the news because it's not dramatic enough. She sounds great. She is. He said it simply, with no performance, and Elena felt the word land in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She watched the ripples spread. They finished dinner. He paid, I'm your senior, I'm your running buddy, and I dragged you away from a deadline, So all three of those things mean I should pay. And they walked back to the office in the silence that felt different from the walk there. Less charged. More settled. Like a wave that had crested and was now retreating, leaving the shore slightly but permanently altered. At the building entrance, he paused. Get some sleep tonight. The pitch deck will still be there tomorrow, and the client will still be indecisive, and none of it will be better or worse for having been wrestled with until 10 p.m. Is that wisdom or experience? Experience. I'm a recovering workaholic. Diane had to stage several very serious interventions before I figured out that sleep was not, in fact, a luxury I would eventually get around to prioritizing. He said her name again. Diane. The stone in her chest again. She thought of the photo on his desk, the dark-haired woman on the beach, the golden retriever, the calm and unguarded happiness of a life that was, from the outside, visibly whole. Good night, Marcus, she said. Good night, Elena. She rode the elevator up to her floor, collected her bag, and rode it back down. She walked home in the warm May dark and did not run, because her legs were tired and her chest was full, and the thought of running right now felt like adding fuel to a fire she was already struggling to contain. That night, lying in bed in her apartment in Lincoln Park with the city sounds filtering up through the window she'd left cracked, she thought about what he'd said. The margins are where the real you lives. She thought about the novel she'd never finished, the woman who moves to a new city and keeps finding herself in the wrong rooms, and she thought about how the wrong room had turned out to be the right city, and the wrong room had turned out to be a job that was actually good, and the wrong room had turned out to be a running club that had introduced her to a man whose wife was named Diane and who had a world's best dad mug on his desk and who looked at her like she was a person worth understanding. She thought about all of this, and then she turned over and pressed her face into the pillow and willed herself to sleep, and it was a long time coming. The weeks accelerated. June arrived with a heat wave that turned the city's lakefront path into a shimmering oven and the office into a place where nobody could quite concentrate. The running club moved its training runs to the cooler hours of the early morning, and Elena found herself at the lobby meeting point at 5:45 a.m. 3 times a week, stretching beside Marcus in the blue-gray pre-dawn light while the city around them was still mostly asleep. They ran together most mornings now. Not officially, the club had 12 regular members and naturally fragmented into pace groups, but organically, the way water finds its level. Marcus ran at a pace that was just fast enough to require focus and just sustainable enough to allow conversation, and Elena ran beside him in that 3-inch space of charged air and felt her world contracting around the axis of these early mornings. She learned things about him. Small, precise things. He had grown up in San Jose and come to Chicago for business school at Kellogg, and he had stayed because he fell in love with the city's grid and its weather and the particular kind of blunt honesty that Midwesterners carried without thinking it was a personality. He had a younger sister who lived in Austin and worked in environmental policy and whom he described as the smart one in the family, the one who actually read the instruction manual for existence. He had a scar on his left knee from a cycling accident at 19 that he carried with what he described as the appropriate amount of regret, which is to say, not enough to have stopped me from cycling again. He did not talk about Diane often. When he did, it was in the same measured, factual way he talked about everything, as a subject he had considered carefully and understood completely. Their wedding. The apartment they had bought in Lincoln Park, 3 blocks from where Elena lived, which made her feel something she refused to name. The decision they'd made to wait a few years before starting a family, a decision that had turned into 5 years and was now, from the careful way he sometimes talked about it, a decision that carried a weight he didn't often set down. Elena learned to listen for the places where his voice changed, where the steady, competent authority dipped into something softer and more uncertain. The family question was one of those places. She heard it one Saturday morning in July, on a run that had gone longer than planned because neither of them had wanted to stop. They were on the path along the lake, 7 miles in, the water flat and pewter gray under a sky that couldn't decide if it was going to rain. They had been running in comfortable silence for the last mile, which was the kind of silence that only exists between people who have run together enough to have nothing left to prove about the act of running beside each other. "Dan's pregnant," Marcus said. He said it to the path ahead of him, not to Elena. He said it in a voice stripped of the usual careful modulation, raw, almost startled, as if the words had surprised him by coming out. Elena's feet kept moving. Hers and his, in that synchronized rhythm they had developed over 2 months of running together. She felt the ground under her shoes and the humid air in her lungs and the shock traveling through her nervous system like electricity through a wire. "Marcus," she said, That's incredible. Congratulations." He nodded. His eyes were still on the path. "We weren't sure it would happen. There were some medical complications early on, some false starts. We did a round of fertility treatment last year that didn't work. We decided to stop trying and just issy. And then, 3 weeks ago, she called me at the office and she was crying, and I thought something was wrong, and she said, 'The baby is fine. I'm just happy.' And I sat in my office with the door closed and I cried too." He said it without looking at her. Elena ran beside him and felt the words land inside her like shrapnel, each one finding a different organ. "That's a beautiful story," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was distinctly impressed by this. "She's about 12 weeks along now. We're not telling people yet, first trimester, you know, but I wanted to tell someone, and I realized I haven't told anyone except my sister." He finally looked at her. His eyes were bright in the gray morning light, and there was something naked in his expression, something unguarded and young and afraid in a way that made him look like a completely different person from the composed, precise man she knew in the conference rooms and the hallways of Morrison and Associates. "I'm terrified," he said. "I'm so happy I can't see straight, and I'm also completely terrified, and I don't know which one is going to win." Elena ran. She ran and she felt her heart slamming against her ribs, and she understood, with a clarity that felt like ice water in her face, exactly how much trouble she was in. Because she was happy for him. She was genuinely, deeply happy for him, happy for Diane, whoever Diane was, who was carrying a baby in a hospital in Chicago while her husband ran beside another woman on a lakefront path and confessed that he was terrified and happy. And she was also, beneath the happiness, in a place so dark and selfish and jealous that she couldn't look at him without feeling like her chest was being opened. She hated herself for this. She hated it with a completeness that made her want to stop running and walk into the lake. "You'll be a great dad," she said. "I know that it got you the way I know that the coffee machine on the east side actually works. It's just a fact." He laughed, and the laugh broke something open in the morning between them. The coffee machine analogy. "Very, Elena. Is that a compliment or—" "It's a compliment." He reached over and briefly touched her shoulder, a quick, warm, entirely platonic press of his palm against her deltoid that lasted exactly 2 seconds and that she felt for the rest of the day like a burn mark that wouldn't fade. They finished the run. They stretched in the lobby. They said goodbye with the easy casualness of colleagues who had just shared 7 miles of path and humidity and confidences, and Elena rode the elevator to her apartment, and she sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her fists against her eyes and did not cry. She did not cry because crying was for things that were finished, and this, whatever this was not finished. It was not even close to finished. It was the beginning of something that she did not have a name for yet. Something that was going to unfold in ways she couldn't predict and that she was going to have to survive without breaking apart. She went to work the next day. She went running on Tuesday. She smiled at Marcus in the hallway and asked him how Diane was feeling and listened to him talk about nausea remedies with the earnest investment of a man who had never had to think about pregnancy before and was now thinking about nothing else. She did her job. She led the nonprofit pitch. It went well. The client loved the emotional narrative. Karen sent her a congratulatory email with 3 exclamation points, and she logged her miles and ate her meals and went to sleep in her apartment in Lincoln Park, 3 blocks from the home that Marcus shared with his wife and the baby that was growing inside her. She did all of this with the desperate, clinging normality of someone who knew that if she stopped moving, she would have to feel what she was actually feeling, and she was not ready for that. July turned to August. The city baked. Elena ran her miles in the early morning and the late evening, sometimes alone and sometimes with the club, and she marked time the way you mark time in a foreign country, by the distance between meals and the phases of someone else's routine. She learned to read Marcus's moods by his running pace, slower when he was tired, faster when something was pressing on him, steady and measured when everything in his life was in the kind of balance that felt permanent. Diane was showing. Elena knew this because Marcus mentioned it once, casually, in the way he mentioned everything, and because the next time she saw him in the office, he was standing by the window in the break room holding a cup of coffee and standing differently than he used to stand. He was standing the way pregnant people stand, or the way their partners stand, with a hand frequently drifting to the small of the back, with a new awareness of the body's changing architecture. He's starting to feel movement, he told Elena on a Thursday morning run in late August. They were 8 miles in, halfway through the long Saturday route they sometimes did when the group thinned out in the summer heat. The lake was a flat, hard blue, and the city across it was shimmering in the haze like something that existed slightly outside of ordinary time. She says it feels like a goldfish swimming. She showed me last night. There was this moment where she put my hand on her belly and the baby kicked, and I felt it, and I thought, this is the realest thing that's ever happened to me. He said it with a wonder that was so unguarded, so completely stripped of his usual composure, that Elena felt it go through her like a blade. That's amazing, Marcus, she said. She ran. She ran and she felt the baby's kick echoing inside her own body, not literally, not physically, but in a way that witnessing something profound can make you feel it in your own chest, your own gut, your own sense of the possible. She was not in love with Marcus Chen. She told herself this firmly, repeatedly, in the shower and on the running path and at her desk during the long afternoons when the work was thin and her mind was not. She was not in love with him. She was in something more complicated and more dangerous than love, something that had no clean name and that lived in the space between admiration and longing and the particular kind of grief you feel when you realize but someone else's happiness is happening in a room you are not allowed to enter. She thought about quitting. Not dramatically, not with a scene or a confrontation, just quietly, sending an email to Karen, finding another job, putting distance between herself and this man who was about to become a father and who looked at her sometimes, in the unguarded moments after a long run or during a quiet conversation in the office hallway, like she was the most interesting person in any room he was in. She thought about it. She did not do it. Because the running had become the architecture of her days, and Marcus was the reason she showed up every morning, and the thought of losing that, of going back to the gray, directionless months that had preceded this job, felt like an amputation she wasn't prepared to survive. She stayed. She ran. She watched Marcus Chen's life unfold toward fatherhood with the frozen, helpless attention of someone watching a car accident in slow motion, unable to look away, unable to intervene, unable to do anything but witness and feel the debris land on her one piece at a time. The charity 10K was in September. Elena had been training for it since June, following the Tuesday through Saturday schedule. So Marcus had recommended increasing her mileage by 10% each week with the methodical discipline that characterized everything he did. She was ready. She knew she was ready. She could run 10 kilometers in her sleep, and she would have the rest of her life to forget why she had needed to. Race morning was cool and clear, one of those perfect Chicago September mornings when the air has just enough bite to remind you that summer is actually leaving and the city opens up like a gift. The race started at Grant Park, near the Buckingham Fountain, and the field was bigger than Elena had expected, 1,500 runners in all, a mix of corporate teams and individual racers, and a strong showing from several Chicago running clubs. Morrison and Associates had a team of 14, wearing the company singlets that HR had ordered specially for the occasion. Elena found Marcus in the crowd near the start line. He was stretching against a railing, wearing his Morrison singlet, and he looked. She stopped herself from finishing that thought. She walked over instead. Nervous? He asked. Terrified, she said. But the good kind. The pre-race terror is just your body trying to talk you out of something it knows will be good for you. He rolled his shoulders. I've run this race 3 times. The course is flat, the crowds are great, and the beer garden at the finish is better than it has any right to be. I'll keep my expectations appropriately low. He looked at her, really looked at her, in a way he sometimes did that made her feel like she was standing in a specific, particular light. Elena, whatever happens in this race, good time, bad time, injury, whatever, I want you to know that having you in the club has been one of the best things that's happened this year. She felt the words land in her sternum and spread outward like warmth from a fire. Marcus, don't make it weird. It's just a thing I wanted to say before we start running, and the adrenaline makes everything feel more significant than it is. He smiled. See you at the finish. The race began at 8. They started together in the middle of the pack and found their rhythm quickly, a comfortable 7:40 mile that would carry them through the 10K in just over 47 minutes, which was fast without being reckless. The course wound through the park and along the river and back through the South Loop, and the crowds were thick and enthusiastic and held signs with jokes and encouragement, and Elena ran with her feet on the pavement and her lungs full of September air, and Marcus beside her and felt, for one crystalline moment, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. At mile 5, Marcus's phone rang. She heard it buzzing against his hip, the specific vibration pattern of an incoming call. He reached down and silenced it without looking, without breaking stride. Then it rang again. And again. 3 called in 30 seconds, the kind of rapid, insistent buzzing that meant something was wrong. You should get that, Elena said. It's fine. It's probably. It rang again. He glanced at the screen, and she saw his face change, saw the easy competence of his stride falter for just a moment, saw something move behind his eyes that she didn't recognize. Marcus? He stopped. They were at a water station, and a cluster of runners flowed around them like water around stones, and he stood there with his phone in his hand and his face doing something complicated and terrible. It's Diane, he said. I have to take this. I'm sorry. I have to. He answered. Elena stood beside him and heard the tinny, half-audible sound of a woman's voice on the other end, not panicked, not crying, but urgent in the way that medical things are urgent, in the way that changes of plan are urgent. She watched Marcus's expression cycle through understanding and alarm and a terrible, dawning kind of fear. He hung up. He looked at Elena with an expression she had never seen on his face before, a raw, unguarded terror that belonged to a different man than the one she'd been running beside for 3 months. She fell, he said. At home. She's okay, the baby is okay, but she fell on the stairs and she's bleeding and she's at Northwestern now and they want me there and He stopped. He was breathing too fast. I'm 30 miles from Northwestern. The race route doesn't go near, I can't get there fast enough. Elena's mind, which had spent the last 3 months in a kind of emotional freefall, suddenly crystallized into something sharp and clear and useful. Go, she said. Slag down a cab. I'll text Karen, we'll explain. Go. He looked at her for 1 second that felt like an hour. And then he did something he had never done before in the entire time she had known him. He stepped forward and put his arms around her and held her, briefly and tightly, in the middle of a crowded race route at mile 5 while 1,500 runners streamed past them. Thank you, he said into her hair. His voice was ragged. Thank you, Elena. And then he was gone, running against the flow of the race, flagging down a cab on Michigan Avenue, disappearing into the September morning like a stone dropped into water. Elena stood at the water station for a long moment, her arms still holding the shape of his embrace. Then she picked up a cup of water and drank it in one swallow and started running again. She finished the race in 49 minutes. She didn't care about her time. She crossed the finish line and walked straight to the beer garden and sat at a picnic table in the sun and drank a beer that tasted like nothing and watched the other Morrison runners cross the finish line one by one and thought about Diane Chin, who was at Northwestern Memorial Hospital with blood on her clothes and a baby in her belly and a husband who had run to her like she was the only address that mattered. She thought about it, and she felt the jealousy and the grief and the longing that she had been refusing to name for 4 months. And she sat in the sun and let them come, let them move through her like weather, like a storm she had been holding off for so long that it arrived all at once, overwhelming and total. She did not cry. She had gotten very good at not crying. But she sat at that picnic table for a long time, drinking her beer, and she let the truth of her own situation settle into her bones with the weight of something she could no longer deny or outrun. She was in love with a married man whose wife was carrying his child, and the only honorable thing to do was to walk away, and she didn't know if she was strong enough to do it. Diane was fine. The baby was fine. The fall had been minor, a slip step on the basement stairs, a surface abrasion that had looked more dramatic than it was, and by the time Marcus texted the Morrison Runners group chat from the hospital waiting room, the collective anxiety of 14 coworkers had already begun to dissipate into relieved emoji and exclamation points. But the moment had changed something. Elena felt it in the way Marcus looked at her the following Tuesday morning at the running group, a look that carried a new kind of weight, a new kind of awareness, as if the embrace at mile 5 had been a door that neither of them had meant to open and that was now standing open between them whether they liked it or not. They ran together. Of course they ran together, they always ran together. But there was a new distance in it now, a new formality, as if both of them were very carefully not looking at the door. He talked about the hospital and Diane's recovery and the surreal experience of sitting in a waiting room while a doctor explained the fetal monitor readings in a calm, professional voice as if the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. He talked about it the way he talked about everything, with precision, with care. But Elena heard the places where his composure thinned, and she felt the corresponding tightening in her own chest, and they ran the remaining miles in a silence that was different from the comfortable silences they'd shared before. This was a silence with teeth in it. After the run, as they stretched in the lobby, he said, "I owe you a race. A 10K that you finished without me. You owe me nothing. I left you at mile 5 of a race. That counts as owing. Marcus says you were going to your wife in a hospital. That's not something you owe me an apology for." He stood up from his stretch. He was looking at her with that steady, appraising attention that she had fallen into the habit of meeting with a careful neutrality. But his eyes were doing something different today, something that looked, from the inside of her own desperate, hopeful chest, almost like longing. "I know what I owe," he said quietly. "That's not the same thing as knowing what to do about it." She felt the sentence land in the air between them. She felt the weight of it pressing against the careful walls she had built, and she felt those walls beginning to crack, and she made a decision, a quick, clear, survival-level decision, to pretend she hadn't heard it. "See you Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he agreed. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button and did not look back. She rode up to her floor and sat at her desk and opened a spreadsheet and stared at it without seeing a single number, and she thought, he knows. He knows something. And then, he doesn't know what he knows. And then, and if he did, it wouldn't change anything, because Diane is pregnant and the baby is fine and your feelings are a rounding error in the vast and ordinary machinery of someone else's life. She opened a blank document on her computer. She typed the first line of the novel she had never finished. The woman who moves to a new city thinks she is starting over, but what she is actually doing is rehearsing the same scene, the same emotional arc, the same 3-inch space of charged air between her body and someone else's, until she can perform it perfectly enough to believe it's real. She stared at the sentence. She deleted it. She wrote it again. She deleted it again. She closed the document and opened the spreadsheet and did her work and logged her miles and went home and lay in bed in the dark and thought about the sentence she couldn't stop writing and deleting, and she understood, with the cold, clarifying clarity of someone who has been running from a truth so long that standing still feels like the same thing as confession, that the novel was about her, that it had always been about her, that the woman who moves to a new city and keeps finding herself in the wrong rooms is not a metaphor for anything except the specific, literal, devastating truth of Elena Vasquez's life. She lay in bed and she did not sleep, and she made a decision that felt less like a decision and more like an act of self-preservation. She was going to stop running with Marcus Chen. She was going to stop running with Marcus Chen, and she was going to do it quietly, without drama, without a conversation that would require either of them to name what was happening in the charged air between their bodies. She was going to join the early morning pace group, the one that met at 6 and ran a slower route along the river. And she was going to let Marcus have the Tuesday through Thursday mornings that had become, without either of them ever explicitly claiming them, theirs. She did it on a Wednesday. She sent an email to the Morrison Runners group, cheerful, casual, nothing that would raise any flags, saying that she decided to try the Tuesday through Saturday training group for a while to mix up her routine and work on her speed. She signed up for a yoga class on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. She rearranged her running schedule so that her paths would not cross his. It was the right thing to do. She knew it was the right thing to do. She did it with the same methodical discipline that Marcus had taught her about training. No shortcuts, no half measures, no excuses, and she felt it working its way through her body like a drug, like a slow and irreversible anesthetic. For the first 3 days, it was almost easy. She went to yoga and bent her body into shapes that demanded all of her concentration, and she ran the early morning river route with a new pace group that included Jalen from her office and a woman from accounting named Priya who talked constantly about her Peloton rankings. She was busy. She was occupied. She was doing all the things that people do when they are trying not to think about something. On the 4th day, a Thursday, she was walking back from a client meeting on the 35th floor when she turned a corner in the hallway and found Marcus standing at the coffee machine on the east side of the floor, the one that actually worked, pouring himself a cup with the slow, deliberate attention of a man who was thinking about something else entirely. He looked up. She stopped walking. They were 8 feet apart, in a hallway that was empty except for them. "I got your email," he said. She felt her heart do something arrhythmic and alarming. "Yeah. I thought I'd try something different for a while. The training schedule, I mean. Mix it up. Lena." Just her name. Just her name, said in his voice, in his particular low-register way, and she felt every wall she had built in the previous 4 months tremble. "I think we both know that's not what the email was about," he said. She looked at him. She looked at the coffee cup in his hand and the tired lines around his eyes and the way he was standing, slightly off balance, in a way that Marcus Chen never stood, and she felt the truth rising in her throat like a wave that was about to break. "If you know that," she said carefully, "then you also know why." "I know what I think I know." He put the coffee cup down on the counter. He put his hands in his pockets, which was something she had never seen him do. Marcus Chen did not fidget. Marcus Chen occupied space with the confidence of a man who had never once doubted his right to be wherever he was standing. "I know that when I ran to the hospital that morning, the only thing I could think about, the only thing that was clearer than the fear or the word or the guilt about leaving you at mile 5, was that I needed to get to you. To tell you I was sorry. To explain. And I thought about it all the way to the hospital. And I realized that I couldn't explain, because I didn't have a framework for what I was feeling that didn't involve making everything worse. Marcus, please don't. I'm not making this weird. I'm just..." He stopped. He pressed his lips together and exhaled slowly through his nose, and she watched him do the thing that she had seen him do 100 times in conference rooms and client presentations, the deliberate act of gathering himself, of reassembling his composure from the scattered pieces that she had spent months scattering. "I'm just telling you what happened. What happened is that I ran to my wife in a hospital and I sat in a waiting room and I held her hand and I listened to the fetal monitor and I thought about how lucky I was, and all of that was real. And somewhere alongside of all of that, In some part of my mind that I don't have a name for, and that I don't want, and that I didn't ask for, I was thinking about you. The hallway was very quiet. Somewhere far away, a phone rang and stopped. The HVAC system cycled on with its low, constant hum. Elena stood in front of Marcus Chen in the middle of a hallway on the 34th floor of a glass tower in Chicago, and she felt the ground shift under her feet in a way that had nothing to do with architecture. "That doesn't change anything," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "You're married. You're having a baby. None of this, whatever this is, it can't be about us." "I know. Then why are you telling me this?" He looked at her with those steady, appraising eyes, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something in them that she could not read, a depth, a complexity, a moral ambiguity that did not belong to the composed and precise man she'd been running beside all summer. It belonged to someone else, to the version of Marcus Chen that existed in the spaces between his competence and his desire, in the margins that he had told her the real her lived in. She understood, with a sick, lurching clarity, that he was showing her the margins of himself, and that the margins were not clean. "Because you deserve to know," he said. "Because you changed something in me this summer that I can't change back, and you did it without asking for anything, and that's not something I can just carry around inside me without acknowledging. You deserve to know that what you did, the way you showed up, the way you ran beside me, the way you let me be honest with you about being terrified, that mattered. That changed me. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what to do with any of this. But you needed to hear it." She stared at him. She felt the words inside her, all the things she wanted to say and couldn't, all the ways she wanted to reach for him and couldn't, all the versions of this conversation that played out in her head on a loop every night at 3 in the morning, and she felt them crystallize into something hard and sharp and final. "I didn't change you," she said. I was there. I was available. That's not the same thing as being responsible for someone. Elena. No. Listen to me." She stepped forward. One step, closing the distance between them to 4 feet, to 3, to something that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. "You are about to be a father. Your wife nearly lost her baby last week, and she's lying in a hospital bed right now, and you are standing in a hallway telling me that I changed you. I know what that's like. I know what it feels like to have someone tell you that you've changed them, and I know how much weight that carries, and I also know that it's not a license. It's not an invitation. It's not a story that has any kind of future that doesn't destroy something." He was quiet. She could see his jaw working, could see the slight tremor in his hands that he was trying to hide by keeping them in his pockets. He was a man standing at the edge of something he had never stood at before, and he was trying to find his footing, and she was the ground he was trying to find. "You're right," he said finally. "You're right. I'm not thinking clearly. Diane's in the hospital, and the baby, and I'm running on no sleep and too much coffee, and whatever part of my brain handles making good decisions is currently offline." He stepped back. One step, then another. Re-establishing the distance. Reinstalling the walls. "I shouldn't have said any of that. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. I am, though. Because none of this is fair to you. You came to a new city, and you got a new job, and you joined a running club, and you deserve a clean version of all of that. Not whatever this is." She watched him retreat. She watched the professional, composed Marcus Chen reassemble himself from the scattered pieces, watched the composure settle back over his features like a mask being fitted back into place. And she felt everything. The loss and the relief and the grief and the gratitude, all of it at once, all of it pressing against her chest like hands. "Go be with your wife," she said. "I'll see you around the office." She walked past him. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood there waiting while the floors ticked down on the digital display, and she did not look back. She heard him walk in the other direction, his footsteps on the carpet, measured and unhurried, the footsteps of a man who had been walking away from something he wanted for so long that he had gotten very good at it. The elevator came. She got in. She rode it to the lobby and walked out into the September afternoon and kept walking until she reached the lakefront path, and then she started running. And she ran until the sun went down and the city lights came on and the lake turned black and her legs gave out beneath her. Then she walked home. She showered. She lay in bed. She did not sleep. At 3 in the morning, she opened her laptop and found the blank document and she wrote. She had always believed that the right life would announce itself clearly. But some lives don't announce themselves. Some lives just happen to you, in hallways and running paths, and early mornings and late nights, and the 3-inch space between your body and someone else's, and all you can do is decide what kind of witness you want to be to your own story. She saved the document. She closed the laptop. She turned over and pressed her face into the pillow, and this time, finally, she let herself cry, long, shaking, silent sobs that she muffled with the pillow because she lived in a building with thin walls and she was a woman alone, and she had learned, over the course of a summer that had changed everything, that some griefs are private even when they're universal, even when they're the oldest story in the world. A woman loves a man who belongs to someone else, and the only way out is through. She ran the Chicago Marathon 3 weeks later. Not with the Morrison runners. She'd rejoined the Tuesday through Saturday training group and let the Pace group sort themselves around her, but she saw Marcus at the starting line. He was with a group of colleagues, wearing a Morrison singlet, and when he saw her across the corrals, he raised a hand. She raised hers back. They did not speak. They did not need to. She finished in 3 hours and 52 minutes, a personal best by 12 minutes, achieved on legs that had been rebuilt over 4 months of early morning miles and in a heart that had been rebuilt over a summer of loving someone she could not have. She crossed the finish line in Grant Park and bent over to catch her breath and felt the sun on the back of her neck and thought, I'm going to be okay. I'm going to be okay. I'm not there yet, but I'm going to be okay. She straightened up. She accepted a space blanket from a volunteer and wrapped it around her shoulders and stood in the sun and let the enormity of the day wash over her, the crowds and the noise and the exhaustion and the pride, and she felt, for the first time in months, something that was not grief. It was not joy, not exactly. It was something quieter than joy, something more durable. It was the feeling of having run the distance. Of having done the thing, not perfectly, not without pain, but completely. Of having shown up at the starting line and kept going when every part of her wanted to stop, and having crossed over into whatever came next on the other side of the finish. She thought about Marcus. She let herself think about him, not the hallway conversation, not the terrible weight of the confession, but the earlier thing. The first morning. The way he'd looked at her in the lobby and said, "You're Elena Vasquez," like he was confirming something he already knew. The way he'd fallen into step beside her and said nothing for the first mile and then said something that made her laugh. The way he'd been, in all the small and precise ways that mattered, exactly the kind of person she would have chosen if she'd had the freedom to choose. She let herself think about him, and then she let it go. She felt it leave her body the way the marathon had left it, gradually, then all at once, like a tide going out and leaving the shore clean and new and ready for whatever came next. She walked to the beer garden. She found Priya from accounting and Jalen from her team. She ordered a beer that was cold and tasted like celebration. She drank it in the sun with the city humming around her and the finish line medals being handed out to runners who had done the thing she had just done, and she felt the September air fill her lungs, and she felt the ground under her feet, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, in a summer that had tested every wall she built, like she was home. Not in the way she'd expected. Not with the person she'd thought. But home nonetheless. In the city, in the job, in the body that could run 26.2 miles and still stand up afterward. In the story she was riding in the margins of everything, slowly, imperfectly, but riding. She took a photo of her medal and her beer and the skyline behind it and the lake beyond that. She didn't post it. She just looked at it for a long time, memorizing the way the lights fell, the way the day felt, the way she herself looked, tired and strong and alive and ready for whatever the next mile held. Then she drained her beer, folded up her space blanket, and walked out of the park and into the rest of her life. The months that followed moved differently than the months that had come before. They moved with the steadier, less charged rhythm of a life that had passed through something and come out the other side, not unchanged, never unchanged, but rearranged. Rebuilt. Elena ran her miles. She did her job. She went to yoga on Tuesdays and Thursdays and discovered that she was good at it. Not good in the showy, performative way that she had once been good at things in order to prove something, but good in the quiet, internal way that Marcus had talked about when he described making his work feel like a choice rather than a sentence. She was good at yoga because it required nothing from her except presence, and presence was the one thing she had learned to give herself over the summer, presence, and patience, and the willingness to be still long enough to feel whatever needed to be felt. She thought about Marcus less. The thought surprised her when she first noticed it, the way you notice, in the middle of a long run, that your legs have found a rhythm you didn't consciously choose. She still saw him in the office. She still ran into him in hallways and elevators and the break room where the good coffee machine hummed its slow, constant hum. He was friendly, professional, warm in the measured, appropriate way that senior directors are warm to colleagues they have no complicated history with. He had, she understood, done the thing that men like Marcus Chen do when they find themselves at the edge of something they didn't plan. They step back. They reassemble. They become, once again, the version of themselves that is easiest to live with. Diane had the baby in November. A girl. Elena knew this because there was a company-wide email sent by Marcus with the subject line introducing Charlotte Rose Chun, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, perfect in every way, and the body of the email contained 3 photos and a short paragraph that managed to be simultaneously heartfelt and so professionally appropriate that it could have been written by a PR team. Elena read the email at her desk. She looked at the photos, Charlotte, red-faced and wailing in the delivery room, Diane, exhausted and radiant in her hospital bed, Marcus, holding his daughter with an expression that Elena recognized and could not allow herself to feel anything about. She sent a reply to the group email, a standard congratulations, the kind anyone would send, and she closed her inbox and went back to her spreadsheet and did not think about it for the rest of the day. Or that's what she told herself. What actually happened was that she thought about it constantly, in the background, in the margins, in the same way that a song you can't get out of your head plays on without you asking it to. She thought about Marcus holding his daughter. She thought about the way he had held her, Elena, at mile 5 of the charity 10K, briefly and tightly, in the middle of a crowded race route while his wife's blood was on his mind and his phone was ringing with news that changed everything. She thought about the difference between those 2 embraces and the way the difference contained a whole novel's worth of truth that she was not going to write but that she understood, in her bones, with the completeness of someone who had lived inside it. November became December. The city turned cold and hard and beautiful in the way that Chicago only gets when it decides to stop pretending it's not winter. Elena bought a real Christmas tree for her apartment, a Douglas fir, not the cheap fake one she'd used the previous year, and she put it in the corner of her living room and strung it with lights and stood in front of it on December 23rd with a glass of wine and a feeling she couldn't quite name. It wasn't happiness, exactly. Happiness was too simple a word for what she felt, which was something more layered and harder one, something that had been built out of pain and distance in the slow, deliberate work of putting one foot in front of the other until the distance became bearable. She felt it in her body, in the steadiness of her breathing, in the absence of the constant low-grade anxiety that had been her companion for so long that she'd started to think of it as a personality trait rather than a symptom. She felt it in the new novel taking shape on her laptop, not the old one about the woman who moves to a new city, but a new one, a different one, about a woman who runs and what running teaches her about the distance between where you are and where you want to be. She felt it, most of all, in the morning run she was doing now, alone, in the dark, in the cold, in the city that had become hers through sheer repetition and stubbornness. She ran along the lake in temperatures that made her lungs ache and her eyes water, and she ran past the glass towers that were lit up for the holidays, and she ran through the particular silence of a winter morning in Chicago, a silence so complete that it felt less like the absence of sound and more like the presence of something vast and patient and indifferent to the small dramas of human longing. She ran, and she thought about Charlotte Rose Chen, who was 6 weeks old now and probably sleeping through the night in a crib in Lincoln Park, 3 blocks from Elena's apartment, in a life that Elena would never be part of. She thought about Diane, who had nearly lost her baby on a basement staircase in September and who was now, presumably, learning to be a mother with the same methodical, patient competence that her husband brought to everything he did. She thought about Marcus, who had stood in a hallway on the 34th floor and told her that she had changed something in him that couldn't be changed back, and who had then done the hardest and bravest and most necessary thing a person can do when they find themselves at the edge of something they didn't plan. He had stepped back. He had chosen his life. He had chosen it not because it was easy or because he didn't feel the pull of the alternative, but because it was right, and the fact that the right choice and the painful choice were sometimes the same choice was one of those truths that Elena had learned to carry without requiring it to make sense. She finished her run. She stretched on the cold pavement outside her building, breath clouding in the December air. She looked up at the sky, pale gray, the color of old bone, as she felt the cold in her lungs and the ache in her legs and the particular, unnamed fullness in her chest that she had come to understand was the feeling of being alive on the other side of something you weren't sure you would survive. She went inside. She made coffee. She sat at her kitchen table with the Douglas fir glowing in the corner and her laptop open to the new novel, the one about running, the one about distance. The one about the 3-inch space between bodies that sometimes means everything and sometimes means nothing and always, always, means something you have to earn by staying in the room long enough to find out. She wrote a chapter. She wrote it badly, then better, then badly again. She wrote it the way you run a long distance, with the knowledge that perfection is not the goal, that endurance is, that the only finish line that matters is the one you set for yourself, and that every mile between here and there is a mile you can be proud of for the simple, irreducible reason that you are still moving. At noon, she closed the laptop. She went to meet Priya for lunch at a new place on Division Street that did good ramen and had communal seating, which meant she would have to talk to strangers and be social and pretend that the life she was living was not, at its core, a quiet act of reconstruction. She put on her coat. She locked her apartment. She walked down the hall and out into the cold December city, and she felt the air hit her face and the ground beneath her feet in the strange, quiet certainty, the one that had been growing in her since the marathon, since the hallway conversation, since the moment she had decided to stop running with Marcus Chen and start running toward whatever came next, that she was going to be okay. Not perfect. Not whole in the way that the word whole implies a return to some earlier, unbroken state, but okay in the way that mattered, present, upright, moving forward. A woman who had loved someone she couldn't have and had survived it, and who was using the survival, slowly, imperfectly, honestly, to build something that was hers. The story was not over. The best stories never are. But the chapter she was in now, this one, this winter, this version of herself that was still being written in the margins of everything, was a chapter she could live in. A chapter she could be proud of. A chapter that contained, in its messy and incomplete and very human way, the thing she had been looking for since she was 27 years old and standing in a kitchen in Evanston watching an engagement fall apart in slow motion, not a happy ending, but a true one. She walked to the restaurant. She pushed through the door and the warm air hit her and Priya waved from a corner table, and Elena crossed the room and sat down and ordered the tonkatsu and laughed at something Priya said about Jalen's true crime podcast habit, and the afternoon unfolded in front of her like a door opening, not dramatically, not with fanfare, just simply, quietly, the way the right life eventually does when you stop trying to force it and start letting it happen. She was 29 years old. She was in Chicago. She was running her miles and writing her chapters and learning, slowly, to live in the room she had finally stopped trying to escape. And for now, for this December afternoon, for this bowl of ramen, For this table and this friend and this life that was imperfect and challenging and entirely, unmistakably hers, that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. Spring came to Chicago the way it always does in the years after something has changed, tentatively at first. Days that warmed and then cooled again, and then all at once, the way a door opens when you finally stop leaning against it. The Douglas fir in Elena's apartment had shed its needles by February and been disposed of with the quiet ceremonial finality of holiday traditions that have served their purpose. The lake path thawed. The running crowds returned. And Elena, who had logged more miles through a Chicago winter than she had in any previous season of her life, found herself in April standing at the starting line of the Chicago Spring Half Marathon with her race number pinned to her shirt and her new running watch on her wrist and a feeling in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like herself. Not the version of herself she had been performing for other people, the competent marketing coordinator, the reliable colleague, the woman who had her life together in a way externals suggested. Not the version she had been running from, the woman with the failed engagement and the drawer full of regret and the unfinished novel that had been gathering dust since Evanston. But the actual version. The one underneath. The one who had been, as Marcus had once put it in a conversation she still carried like a talisman, living in the margins. The race started. She ran. The course wound through the city and along the lake and through neighborhoods she had come to know intimately over 11 months of early morning miles, and she ran it in a time that surprised her. Under 90 minutes, a full 9 minutes faster than any half marathon she had ever run. She crossed the finish line and bent over to catch her breath, and when she straightened up, she saw a familiar figure standing near the volunteer tent, wearing a Morrison and Associates running jacket and holding 2 bottles of water. Marcus. He was not supposed to be there. The Morrison and runners had a spring 5K scheduled for the same morning, a different course in a different part of the city. She didn't know why he was here, at her race, at her finish line, holding water like it was the most natural thing in the world. She walked toward him with her legs still trembling from the effort of 26 miles of running and the strange, electric awareness that comes from seeing someone you have spent months trying not to think about. You weren't at the 5K, she said. I wasn't at the 5K. He handed her a water bottle. His face was doing something she couldn't quite read, something between pride and something softer, more complicated. I wanted to see you finish. She drank the water. It was cold and it tasted like everything she had been denying herself for the past 11 months, the simple, uncomplicated pleasure of being seen by someone who mattered. She swallowed and looked at him and felt the old 3-inch space open up between them, and for the first time, she did not flinch from it. How's Diane? She asked. She's good. Charlotte is. He paused, and she watched his face transform the way it always did when he talked about his daughter, the way all the careful composure melted away and left something young and unguarded and luminous. Charlotte is extraordinary. She's 6 months old now and she's starting to teethe and she laughs at everything, the ceiling fan, the dog, even a piece of broccoli yesterday. Elena felt the story land inside her, not as a wound this time, but as a gift. Charlotte laughing at broccoli. Charlotte laughing at the world. Charlotte existing in a house 3 blocks from where she sat, in a life that was whole and complete and entirely separate from the one she was building in the margins. She sounds amazing, Elena said. And she meant it. She meant it in the way that you mean things when you have finally stopped fighting the truth of them, simply, directly, without the defensive architecture of irony or deflection. She is. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him deciding something, could see the small, internal negotiation that happened in the space between what he felt and what he said. Elena, I need to tell you something. Okay. I'm not here because I was checking up on you. I'm not here because I feel guilty or because I'm worried about you or because I felt like I owed you something from the race in September. He paused. I'm here because I needed to see you. Because I think about you more than I should and less than I want to, and I've spent the last 11 months trying to figure out what to do with that, and I still don't know. But I know I needed to see you. And I know that whatever this is, whatever we've been carrying, it's not something either of us should have to carry alone." The race crowd moved around them. Runners crossed the finish line and collapsed on the grass and were handed medals and water bottles and foil blankets. The sun was warm and the lake was sparkling and the city was doing its spring thing, shaking off the winter like a dog shaking off water, ready to begin again. Elena looked at Marcus Chen. She looked at the man who had changed everything and whom she had loved in the specific, terrible, clarifying way that you love someone who is not yours to love. She looked at him and she felt the old feeling rise in her chest, and she let it come, let it move through her without fighting it, without building walls against it, without any of the defensive architecture that had been her default setting for so long. Then she let it go. She let it go the way she had learned to let things go on long runs when her body demanded rest and her mind demanded more, with the understanding that stopping was not the same as failing, that the distance she had already covered was still distance, that the finish line was not the only measure of the run. She let it go because she had earned the right to let it go, through months of early morning miles and cold December runs and the slow, patient work of rebuilding herself from the inside out. "Marcus," she said, "you changed my life too. You know that, right? The running, the conversations, the way you looked at me like I was someone worth understanding, you changed something in me that I didn't know was broken until you fixed it. And I will always be grateful for that." She watched his face as he heard her. She watched the words land, watched him absorb them.
Watched the complicated expression on his face resolve into something she recognized, recognition. The same recognition she had felt in the hallway on the 34th floor, in the early morning light, when he had told her that she had changed something in him that couldn't be changed back. "But I need you to hear something too," she continued. "I need you to hear that I am okay. That I am actually, genuinely, for the first time in years, okay. And that the part of me that loved you, the part that I thought was going to destroy me,
has become the part of me that writes, that runs, that shows up, that is here, today, at the finish line of a half marathon, having just run the best race of my life, because I decided that surviving was the same thing as living, and living was the same thing as moving forward." She took a breath. The spring air was full of cherry blossoms and lake breezes and the particular, ineffable sweetness of a Chicago morning in April. "You were the wrong room," she said. "But you were also the door. And I walked through it, and I'm on the other side now, and I need you to know that the other side is good. It's really, really good." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he stepped forward, not into the 3-inch space, not close enough to touch, but forward nonetheless, and he said, "I know. I've watched you. From the distance, from the office, from the edges of rooms where you didn't know I was paying attention. I've watched you become someone who doesn't need anyone to tell her that she's enough. And I want you to know, I need you to know, that watching that is one of the proudest things I've ever done." Elena felt the tears come, not the silent, suppressed tears of the woman in the apartment who had cried into her pillow on December nights, but clean tears, the kind that come when something important is being honored. She let them come. She didn't wipe them away. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you," he said. They stood there for another moment, two people at a finish line who had been, for one season of their lives, the most important person in each other's story. Then Marcus reached out and briefly squeezed her hand, the way you squeeze the hand of someone who has just done something extraordinary, the way you acknowledge a finish line even when the race is not yours, and he stepped back. "I've got to go," he said. "Charlotte's daycare graduation is at 11, and Diane would kill me if I missed it." "Yes, daycare has graduation. Yes, it's as adorable as it sounds." Elena laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded. Go to the graduation." He smiled. It was the same smile she had seen in the lobby on that first May morning, when he had looked at her and said, "You're Elena Vasquez," like he was confirming something he already knew. It was the smile of a man who had been part of a story that mattered, impossible to navigate without leaving marks.